I've had to jump on somebody else's computer to say hello and welcome Ian. So anyway, welcome everybody to this seminar by Ian Mason. Ian is well, I thought he was an energy researcher, but it looks like he's expanding his considerable intellectual expertise into some new areas. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this talk today, looking at opportunities to both reduce agricultural emissions and enhance biodiversity at the same time. Obviously addressing one of the critical issues that we have today for New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions profile. And so looking at a really creative and fascinating way to try and help resolve this problem. Ian, I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk. I'm chairing it. I will hopefully move back to my own computer and be able to take questions in due course. But in the meantime, I'll welcome you to get started, and then I'll jump in once you've finished just to mediate the question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Christchurch. It's a great pleasure to be talking with you again in Dunedin. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you all for being here. So my title today is Power to Food, and I'm framing this as an opportunity to make significant reduction in agricultural emissions and at the same time enhance biodiversity. So we're going to start off with a rural microbiology and then look at some bioprocess engineering. And just apropos to Janet's comment, this takes me back to my first degree. So I did study bioprocess engineering at the undergraduate level. We'll then dwell briefly on New Zealand's emissions profile, and then move to a case study which looks at replacing milk protein or a proportion thereof in the New Zealand context using a precision fermentation product. I'll then cover the electricity demand and supply options before moving on to the concept of rewilding of retired or freed up farmland. And I'll present a business model from the Scottish Highlands, and then we'll draw some conclusions. But firstly, I'd like to just outline three key factors which motivated me to take an interest in this area. Firstly, as Janet said, the urgent need to reduce our agricultural emissions. And I'm proposing here a 25% reduction in dairy emissions as a case study to explore the issues. Secondly is the rapid rise in the potential for offshore wind in New Zealand. We have at the moment 4 international developers who are putting forward proposals at the gigawatt scale, and this is very, very active at the moment. EMB are working hard right now on the regulatory framework, and people are talking about first power delivered by 2030. And thirdly, the development of precision fermentation using hydrogen-oxidising bacteria. We've known about this for a long time, but a Finnish company, Solar Foods, proceeding to full scale with this process. They've got regulatory approval for using their product in Singapore as we speak. And so I'm just going to have to get rid of the part of the right. Okay. And George Monbiot's book, Regenesis, came along at just the right time. And he devotes some considerable space to talking about the Solar Foods process, as well as covering regenerative agriculture, organics, and other options which people are considering. So hydrogen-oxidising bacteria, these are chemoautotrophs, which means they can get their energy from inorganic sources. And in this case, there are 3 gaseous elements which play a key role: hydrogen, oxygen, and CO2, plus nutrients, and that forms biomass. These organisms have been known, as I said, for many, many decades. They're found in soils, particularly in temperate regions. They're found in geothermal areas, and they're even found in the Antarctica. They can be isolated from the environment. They can be plated out on petri dishes, as you can see there in the left-hand image. They can be then propagated, and once we have sufficient concentration of those organisms, we can put them into a stainless steel vessel, which you can see in the middle image there. This is a continuous culture operation. This is the finished process. Those of you who've been to a brewery or a winery or even a dairy factory will be familiar with stainless steel tanks, reactors, stainless steel pipelines, stainless steel pumps. So a good way to think about this precision fermentation process is akin to a brewing process. The product is illustrated on the right-hand side there. That's the dried product coming out of the process, which is then utilised as a food ingredient. So a quick view of the development of the process. NASA had a look at this in the 1960s with regards to long-distance space travel, and a continuous culture process was developed and reported by Foster and Litchfield. Actually, I think there's a wee typo there. It should be LITCH, but I'll correct that before the slides go out. And then it wasn't until the 2010s when this concept was picked up by Finnish researchers, firstly at LUT University and at one of their research centres, VTT. And two of those researchers picked this up, formed the company Solar Foods in 2017, and operated a pilot scale plant from 2018, just producing 1 kilogram a day to sort out the process details and have a look at the product characteristics. The two gentlemen pictured on the right-hand side there are the two founders of Solar Foods. I don't speak Finnish, so apologies for my pronunciation, but it's Dr. Pasi Vainika and Dr. Juha-Pekka Pitkanen. They've been recognised by the European Union as one of their very important projects in 2022, and that's actually for a number of reasons, not just the one which we're talking about today. And Business Finland gave them 34 million euros of grant to help them set up their first factory, which is now being constructed. So they called it Factory 01, and the kit is being installed as we speak. So the factory is being built and kitted out this year, and they're aiming to be operational in the first quarter of 2024. And as I mentioned earlier, the product has been approved for use as a food ingredient in Singapore. That approval came through last year, and the approvals are pending in other jurisdictions at this present time. So food out of thin air is a headline which appeared, and it's a little bit of journalistic license, but it does make for a good headline. So the diagram on the left-hand side shows three of the gaseous components which are fed into the process. Firstly, CO2 on the left-hand side, and DAC stands for direct air capture. So basically CO2 is filtered out of the airstream, concentrated and fed into the process. And then using renewable electricity, in this case they've illustrated solar and wind, electricity going into the electrolyzer to produce hydrogen and oxygen from the splitting of water. And the hydrogen is fed into the bioprocess. The diagram's a wee bit misleading there, but the hydrogen is also fed into the bioprocess. In principle, some of it can be fed to the right-hand side. So nitrogen can be removed from the air, combined with hydrogen through the Haber Bosch process, which we've known about for 100 years or so now, and which operates in New Zealand, to produce ammonia, which is one of the key nutrients. So minerals are required for the nutrient mix, and the product, once it's ready, is quite wet, so it needs to go through dewatering and drying before it can be utilised. So on the right-hand side, you'll see listed some of the key ingredients, and I've just bolded up the chemical symbols there. So CHONPS. So the microbiologists amongst you will recognise that as a generic formula for biomass. There are a number of other ingredients which need to be fed into the process, including magnesium, sodium, potassium ion, and plus a bunch of micronutrients as well. The process is quite energy intensive because we've got DAC and electrolysis, as well as the heating and the temperature control and the drying, etc. for the bioprocess. And that energy can be sourced through electricity and thermal separately, or it can be sourced directly as electricity and converted to thermal energy in the course of the process. The hydrogen, of course, we're talking green hydrogen here, and this diagram comes from the Norwegian company NEL, which has been operating electrolyzers in Norway for many, many decades. So this is a mature technology, and they have the contract to supply the electrolyzer for the factory 01, which I talked about earlier. So just go through quickly the diagram. Electricity fed from three-phase alternating current supply needs to have the voltage adjusted, and then it goes through a rectifier, to convert it into DC. So AC/DC, there's something here for the heavy metal fans. The electrolyzer then produces oxygen, which is typically vented to the atmosphere, although I think some consideration could be given to more productive uses of that stream. The hydrogen then proceeds through a bunch of gas cleanup processes, compression and drying, and finally into storage, and it's fed into the process. This electrolysis is an integral part of the plant, so it's not necessary to have any hydrogen infrastructure, pipelines, major storage, anything like that. And I think this is one of the better uses of hydrogen, green hydrogen, which we could make. So as I said, NEL had the contract that was let about a year ago, and it's worth about 2 million euros, which I would guess indicates a 1 to 2 megawatt plant, but no details have been published at this stage. So that's the hydrogen production. Now, direct air capture, as I said, it's kind of like a filtration process. So this diagram illustrates 2 stages of the operation of direct air capture. The cylindrical filter contains an absorbent of some kind. The air is forced through that filter. And if you can imagine the filter becoming saturated from the left-hand side through to the right-hand side. So once it's full, then it goes into the second phase of operation, which is regeneration. So electricity is supplied for heating, typically for most of the absorbents around 100 degrees. And then a much concentrated CO2 airstream comes out, which is then fed into the process. So again, this can be an integral part of the process. So let's move on now to look at some of the characteristics of the product itself. It's a high protein and low fat product. So up to 75% protein, 10% fat, and we can tweak the process to adjust those ratios accordingly. 10 to 20% carbohydrate, it has some mineral content, typically dried to 5% for packaging and used as a final product. It contains all 9 essential amino acids. It contains vitamins, and it's quite high in B group vitamins especially. It has iron and some fiber content as well. So they've been very busy at Solar Foods in the kitchen, making a whole range of products, and I've just illustrated a few of them there. So the powder itself on the left-hand side, then what looks like cheese and crackers, there's a bread, there's a muesli, meatballs and spaghetti, and more direct way to utilize this product is simply to whip it up into a smoothie. They've also made ice cream from it, and that's been quite successful as well. And there are many, many more products which have been developed, which can be you can find out more about by having a look at their website. So in terms of process analysis, the diagram on the left-hand side shows, firstly, within the purple border, it shows the key operations and processes involved. So the propagation I mentioned earlier, so that's growing up large quantities of the organism before they can be fed into the fermenter. I've got the electrolysis, then following the bioprocess, the product is pasteurized. Then there's a separation process, possibly using centrifuges, I believe that's what they're using, and then drying, and I believe they're using spray drying process. Now, the grade boxes illustrate other elements of the process which are taken into account in the life cycle analysis. So all the emissions and the environmental impacts from electricity production, et cetera, are included in the life cycle analysis. So the things that are left out are the factory itself, the facility, and the packaging is not included. So based on 1 kilogram of product, the electricity utilization is 18 kilowatt hours per kilogram. The greenhouse gases, about 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent, and land use is very, very tiny. And there's a whole bunch of other parameters as well, which I'll illustrate in a moment. So let's just have a look at the global warming potential. Now, this illustrates the impact of 2 different sources of electricity. First is the Finnish average electricity mix. So the Finnish electricity system includes a whole bunch of generation, including hydro, nuclear, and some fossil as well. Also in that column, you'll see the electricity, sorry, you'll see energy for steam raising as well in that light browny color. So you can see the major components there, and that also includes carbon dioxide production, which is brought into the factory. Now, on the right-hand side, we've got FHE, which is the Finnish hydroelectricity only. And also incorporated in that process, the direct air capture is also part of the process, and steam is raised within the plant by through electricity. So it's not raised separately. So that shows us the figure of around about 1 for the FHE, the Finnish hydroelectricity. And that's the figure I'll be using because it applies more closely to New Zealand than the other parameter, which is illustrated there. So looking at the comparative impacts, the left-hand figure shows us data for meat production, for beef production, from beef cattle and from dairy, from fish, poultry, eggs, nuts, peas, and then 2 MPs. So this is microbial protein. So the impacts from the Finnish average electricity mix and the impacts from just using Finnish hydro electricity only. Now, the impacts for the Finnish hydro scenario are so small that they only show up on this diagram here. And you'd have to look very carefully, but you can see a little blip on the right-hand side of that set of histograms, which shows the global warming potential of the Finnish hydroelectricity mix. The other parameters, land use, of course, it's very small. The acidifying emissions, this is acid rain potential, eutrophication, nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., and then the impact on water resources. And so the FHE scenario has a very, very small impact on all of those. We should just point out that the analysis for beef production are based on European and North American practice, so they're not necessarily applicable to New Zealand, and these parameters need to be redone for the New Zealand case before we can make any really firm statements about that. However, I think the relativities will likely remain. The graph on the right-hand side just puts some percentage numbers on there. So if we just go to global warming potential compared to beef production, we have 6% That's for the Finnish average electricity mix, and it will be quite a bit smaller, of course, for the hydroelectricity scenario. So I won't dwell on the rest of those. I'll leave you to have a look at those if you wish after the talk. Whoops. Right, so now looking at New Zealand dairying and the scenario which I want to explore in detail. So New Zealand produced about 21 billion litres of milk in the 1920 season. This contained about 0.84 megatons of protein and about 1 megaton of fat. So this is a high fat, relatively high fat product. In order to calculate the emissions, this needs to be converted to what's known as fat and protein corrected milk. This is milk with 3.3% protein and 4% fat. And if you do the numbers for the actual production in New Zealand, you find that the protein and fat content were actually higher than that. But that comes out to 25 megatons of fat and protein corrected milk. The official emissions factor for that is 0.77. So that results in greenhouse gas contribution of around about 19 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So the example scenario I'm exploring today is to reduce dairy production by 25%, downside the herd accordingly, rewild the freed up land, and use the precision fermentation process that we've explored to replace the milk protein. So, some numbers. You'll recall that the protein production was from New Zealand milk was about 0.8 megatons. So we need to produce about 0.2, that's 25%. And the product, if we take it at around 2/3 protein content, that we need to generate 0.32 megatons of product. That will result in emissions of about 0.34 megatons. And so that's a net removal of 4.5. And it would require a considerable amount of electricity, about 5,800 gigawatt hours per year. That's about 40% of current demand. So it's certainly quite doable in terms of new generation, which is in the pipeline. It's just a little less than what would be required to electrify the light vehicle transport in New Zealand. So it's certainly not out of the question. But where could it come from? So if we were to use solar PV, we'd need 4.4 gigawatts of installed capacity. That's also doable, but it's within the predicted opportunities for solar PV at utility scale in New Zealand. However, it would take up rather a lot of land. Using onshore wind, we'd need 1.7 gigawatts. And that, again, is within the realm of possibilities, given what's in the pipeline. Going to offshore wind, we need a little less, 1.3 gigawatts. I think wind, either onshore or offshore, has a number of advantages over PV. It's a much lower carbon footprint and much more even production during the year. So, and there are a number of other things we could discuss as well. As mentioned earlier, developers are actively proposing new offshore wind. So 7 gigawatts were identified in a study we did some years ago in the South Taranaki. Developers announced 4 gigawatts and another 5 gigawatts off Raglan. So this is from our work, just showing some of the possibilities for fixed foundation turbines off the South Taranaki coast. And then in the hatched areas, there's the possibility for floating turbines to go there as well. So upshot of all this is, yes, we can supply the energy. That's not a big issue. So excuse me for a moment when I take a little drink. So under this scenario, 25% of dairy farmland would be retired, and that's about 0.4 million hectares. And the proposal is to rewild that area to enhance biodiversity. It would also provide a carbon sink and opportunities for education, recreation, and I think a few other opportunities for development as well. In order to obtain biodiversity benefits, it would need to be planted in native forest, because Pinus radiata wouldn't do that. So how would that look? This graph shows CO2 uptake by Pinus radiata in the blue and the green, so just please ignore those. And we're looking at the red lines, which relate to native forest. And this shows over 60 years the uptake of about 500 megatons of CO2. Now that's for 1.3 million hectares of land. So we would, at the best scenario there, we could sequester about, say, 120 approximately megatons of CO2. Now, there's quite a long lag period for native forest, as you can see there, up to 20 years, nothing much is happening. So this would be a long-term project, and it's not a huge amount of CO2 uptake, but it's a positive. It's worth having. So I think it's definitely worth doing. So the status of rewilding throughout the world is increasing at the moment. There's a lot of activity going on in the UK, and particularly in Scotland. And one of the projects is being pursued by a company called Highlands Rewilding. So I'd like to have a look at that as an illustration of what might be done, and we'll see how they're doing. So the purpose of setting up Highlands Rewilding I'll just read the quote there, is nature recovery and community prosperity through rewilding taken to scale in Scotland. So I think those three factors are really important. Nature recovery, but keeping communities involved and having benefits for them. But also, this has to happen at scale if it's to make any meaningful difference. They have obtained to date 3 estates. Bunloit was the first one, and that's illustrated in the top left-hand image there. It's actually on the shores of Loch Ness. And I did think of putting Nessie in there, but I'll leave that to your imagination. The second estate is called Beldorney, and they have just signed the contract for Tavellish, which is a much larger estate. Now, the location of these, 2 of them are shown there in the map, and I'll just try and move the cursor down to, oops. Okay, I won't move the cursor because that's problematic. But Tavellish is down in the bottom left-hand corner in Argyll. So how have they managed to do this? In terms of raising capital, they've had a very successful crowdfunding program and raised nearly £1 million. And that's from basically ordinary people who've been able to invest a minimum of £50 or more if you can afford it. Second, financial institutions such as banks, pension funds, they haven't raised any money from those sources at the moment, but they have been told that a number of these institutions are very interested, and they should come back in a little while. So that's the plan. SIB stands for the Scottish Investment Bank, and they're in there because they have agreed to finance some of the research activities going on in these estates. So it's not exactly capital, but it is financing some of the activities. So that's come through quite recently as well. Then the third category is what they describe as the rest. That includes the people who founded this, and they've contributed around about £7.5 million. which has enabled the purchase of these estates. How is this going to work from a business point of view? The key income streams that they're proposing are from the sale of biodiversity credits. There is a market already in biodiversity credits, and also the sale of carbon credits. There will also be some income from activities such as hosting conferences and retreats. Beldorney has a castle, and Bunloit has facilities for small gatherings, small retreats, etc. So that's another smaller income stream. The two key ones are the sale of credits. They're advertising to investors a potential return of 5% per annum over 10 years. But, pop this back up again now, this is recognised as a high risk to investment, and this is the advice given to all potential investors, that you may lose all your money, so make sure you can afford to lose it before you invest. However, it could turn out to be the opposite. It could be very, very rewarding indeed. The activities to date have focused largely on research and development. So I'll talk just quickly about the research. They've been establishing biodiversity baseline data for the two states, and they've released the first natural capital report on Bunloit, and the second, which includes Bunloit and Beldorney estates. This has involved Scottish universities, Scottish research institutions, and researchers from Oxford University in England. So the quality of the science is very, very good and highly impressive, I think. One of the issues which they've been very cognizant of is that of appropriate governance. And I'm not sure if I should mention co-governance in this talk or not, and also the need to avoid being accusations of neocolonialism. And I know there will be people in the audience, historians, who will be well aware of the 400 years of colonialism that the Highlanders have endured. The Highland clearances, of course, and the general running down of the area. And one can understand the locals being highly sceptical of this type of move. So they've been very aware of that, and particularly since the founder who purchased Bunloit in the first instance is Jeremy Leggett, who's an Englishman. And so an Englishman coming in with a whole bunch of money could be forgiven for generating some skepticism. So that is why they've been very clear about the need for good governance. They've also been very clear, though, that if this is to have any impact, it needs to be done at scale. The Scottish government is highly involved. The predicted capital requirement is around $20 billion. And so there needs to be a balance between mobilising capital and involving the community, making sure the community is involved and obtains some benefit from it. One of the moves that has been made is that to ensure that the governing board is entirely composed of people who are either from the Highlands or are living in the Highlands and who have a vested interest, a real personal interest in the long-term prosperity of the area. There's also a high emphasis on employing people from the region as well. So 16 of the employees, who number 22 at the moment, are actually, as they say, of the Highlands. And one of these is the Chief Ranger on Bunloit, who is, I think, born and raised in Inverness and is certainly very much a Highlander. So and there are more people of that ilk involved in the project. They are offering apprenticeship schemes, They also have school science visits going on, school science projects happening, and a number of other initiatives going on. So the question now arises, is this a suitable model for New Zealand? Well, we're a country of about the same population as Scotland, but the whole of Britain, of course, has a much larger population than us. We have a different cultural setup here, although I think Maori would recognise the colonial aspects of this situation and the need to avoid that happening. So it's my view that there are quite a number of learnings which could be taken from Highlands rewilding and applied in developing things in the New Zealand context. So where to from now? Well, firstly, it seems to me that pilot trials would be a very valuable development, and possibly we get in touch with Solar Foods and obtain a license to set up a pilot plant here using their technology. But there are other options as well. Secondly, a model farm. There are, from memory, there are about 11,000 dairy farms in New Zealand, and there are many other farms. Perhaps there is one farmer who may be interested in taking part in a transition, a downsizing of their farm and a rewilding of their farm. This may require some significant funding. It seems to me that it would be a very, very valuable thing for the government to do, to put some money into funding the operation of a model farm from which we could learn a great deal. A working group to advance things and to provide a networking and sharing platform. And perhaps one might call this a single cell protein working group, although there are probably better names than that. And I was really inspired to suggest this from my experience with the offshore wind working group. This was set up by myself and two young engineers about 3 years ago now. And from that initial group of 3, we've grown to about 90 members. We have the 4 international wind farm developers as members. And quite recently, we've joined up with the New Zealand Wind Energy Association and become quite a powerful force in the development of offshore wind in New Zealand. So I think it's a possibility that we could set up a similar type of group to network and share, get people talking, get people actually acting and doing something about this alternative protein opportunity which has arisen. One of the key elements which I haven't covered in this talk is the co-products of the dairying operation. So as we saw, there's a huge amount of fat produced from milk itself, and then there's the fat from the animal, which is turned into tallow, lactose, then we have the dairy beef production, the hide, etc. So to be fair to dairying, we need at least a baseline study to quantify the impacts of replacing all of these as well. But I think there needs to be an important conversation as well along the lines of, well, do we really need all of this fat in our diet? It's a particular type of fat as well. So can we have a low-fat diet and other alternative ways of doing things? Right, and so this is where the nutritionist could well come in, and I know that Otago has a long and honourable tradition of nutrition science, so I think there's an opportunity for collaboration there. Just 2 of the options for replacing fat and meat and protein. Algal oils, they are on the market, they're around. We've known about those for a very long time, particularly from interest in biodiesel production. So edible algal oils are one possibility. And there's a number of possibilities in the pipeline for alternative proteins, including cultured meat. And very good program on Al Jazeera recently, one of the Earthrise series, in which they illustrate the 3D printing of beefsteaks and lamb, etc. And then the presenter goes to a swanky restaurant in Soho in London, and this meat is cooked and tasted and to general approval. So if you would like to have a look at that program, it actually also features an interview with Kate Rayworth and the production of green steel in Sweden. So it's a really good little program. Please flick me an email and I'll pass the link on to you. In terms of the impact of cultured meat, this is from a very, very recent study looking at the global warming potential in this case, or the carbon footprint. So we can see that cultured meat is comparable to chicken. It's a little better than pork, and it's quite a great deal better than beef production. So taking this scenario a little further then, downsizing of the dairying operation, this will require a just transition if farmers are to be, operations are to be downsized. The focus really needs to be on industrial agriculture. So the Maasai herdsmen of Kenya and the Tibetan nomads, etc., just leave them alone. But certainly there's an opportunity for us to look at industrial agriculture and downsize that. Now, this is deeply embedded in our culture, and any history book will show you that in graphic detail. So this will be a major challenge, certainly from a social science point of view. However, taking the framework which Jeremy Leggett used in talking about the rise of renewable energies, there is an insurgency taking place. These technologies exist. So civil society is demanding action on climate change. The incumbency, of course, is liable to object and resist, just as they did with renewable energy. However, the technology is here, and it is very possible that precision fermentation, cultured meat production, and other such processes could make a significant impact on food production in the future. So in other words, this could be the farming of the future, at least in part. So it's really important to be cognizant of that. So in conclusion, hydrogen bacteria exist and can produce protein at a fraction of the GHG emissions and, in fact, other environmental impacts compared to animal farming. We have the precision fermentation available. If we were to place dairy milk protein, the emissions could drop by 4.5 megatons. But as I said, that would have to be, that would probably drop a little bit if the other animal products were replaced. The 5,800 gigawatt hours per year is easily supplied, including by offshore wind. And the rewilding of freed up farmland could increase the biodiversity, provide a carbon sink, and give community benefits. So with that, I'll draw to a close. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating. Unfortunately, I only came in 10 minutes in because I had to completely close down my laptop and reopen it. But what I heard was challenging, exciting, and filled my head with questions. But I'm going to, as chair, not ask any of those. I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. And I'd like to invite people to either put questions in chat or use the hands up function, and I'll see you and invite you to ask your question. And we will finish at 1 o'clock. So any questions from the audience? Well, in that case, I will leap in with one of my questions, which is, and you may well have covered this already, Ian, but I'll just pop in my question. But it was the cost differential in the finished product between the solar produced or this biologically produced protein and milk.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Janet. I haven't looked in detail at the costs. The only figure I have in my head, which I did see for the Solein product, was about €5 per kg of finished product, which I believe is comparable to milk powder. It's of the same order, of a similar order. However, I think before we get too tied up in economics, I think it's really important to examine whether the current economic paradigm, which is I would describe as mainstream neoclassical growth economics, whether that's actually fit for purpose in evaluating a situation like this. It's the dominant paradigm. It's the one we have to work in today and tomorrow. But I think it's important to listen to people like Kate Rayworth and develop some alternative way of looking at the financial returns and the financial situation involving these future food products. And I think that's a really important area for future research. So yeah, I'm sure there is more information out there about the costs. I know there's a project going on alternative protein production, the cultured meat, etc. And they will probably have more detailed information on the pricing. One thing we're doing with the offshore wind development is looking at a parameter which we're calling society's cost of energy, so SCOE. And the normal parameter which is used is LCOE, which is the levelized cost of energy. But what we're saying is there needs to be a broader scope. And so let's look at society's cost of energy as well and see what the wider term benefits are. So sorry, I couldn't give you a more exact figure.
No, interesting concept. Great. Thank you, Ian. Robert, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Ian. Very interesting talk. I guess I'm responding to your point about the economics, because it seems you would need a completely different economic model for this to go ahead, even if the technology worked, because otherwise you might end up with the whole dairy industry plus this new industry consuming a lot of resources as well. You also have issues like if you had all this renewable energy and direct air capture, that might then find a preferential use in making liquid fuels. So it just seems to be unavoidably mixed up with the economics and overall governance issues.
Yeah, well, thanks, Robert. Good points. I think in response to the energy production, what I would say is that developers are going ahead anyway. They can see a market for their energy at the moment. So if a developer comes along and sets up a 1.3 gigawatt offshore wind farm, then they'll be looking for a market for that energy. And this is one possibility. It's not all going to happen at once, of course. It's going to be spread over a long period of time. And I would expect that any precision fermentation processes would be much smaller. There'd be a bunch of small diversified productions. So a bunch of microbreweries, if you like, spread around the country, rather than having one mega plant sitting somewhere in South Taranaki and taking all the output from a 1 gigawatt wind farm. So it's interesting. This question came up the other day. Someone from TV was asking whether the setting up data centers in New Zealand would be a problem. Would the average person miss out on electricity because it was all going to data centers? And the system doesn't work like that. So I don't really think that's a big issue. But certainly it's something which should be on the table for more detailed work and more detailed discussion. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll go to chat and just grab the first question off chat, and then I'll come back to Phil after that. So the question from Susan: New Zealand exports most of its milk products. Won't other countries develop their own fermentation units? So New Zealand will need to produce less milk.
I think that's a very good point. Yes, it's certainly starting to happen in Europe at the moment and in North America. So I think this is something that the farming industry, well, I'm sure they're aware of it, but it's something that really needs to be on the table as well. In fact, I read a report just yesterday that suggested that precision fermentation, cultured meat, all these alternatives, they could make up, I think it was 11% of the protein market by 2030, and maybe 20% some years after that. So I think as people become more aware of climate change and of the impacts of animal agriculture on the climate and the need to do something about it, and the fact that we have alternatives, then there could be significant moves. And so I think it's a danger in a way for the farming community if they don't recognise this and come and sit around the table and talk through the options.
Great, thank you. Phil.
Hi, Ian, great talk, very interesting. I'm wondering about the offshore wind. Offshore wind's quite more expensive than other forms of renewable energy, and has potentially, but yet unsubstantiated, impacts on sea life and sea floor. And that energy is going to be in demand for other things, like somebody's already pointed out. How would you factor that in? I mean, why offshore wind?
Oh, that's a great question. We get that a lot. I think the first, well, if I could just backtrack, my interest in offshore wind began when I simply pondered the question, why is offshore wind not on the table when we're talking about renewable energy in New Zealand? And the narrative going around at the time was, well, A, we don't need it, and B, the seabed off New Zealand coast just falls away so steeply you couldn't put a fixed foundation turbine there anyway. So we went in and did the research, and we found that there was a great potential and there were areas for fixed foundation turbines. So at that point, it was just on the table as part of the energy mix. In terms of cost, yes, it is currently more expensive than onshore wind, and I think it's more expensive than and onshore wind is a wee bit more expensive than PV. But as I pointed out, PV has a number of disadvantages, including a much higher carbon footprint. So if we then look at wind, we have the potential for onshore wind to contribute to this. I've just used offshore because I think it does have a number of advantages. So, but focusing back on the point of cost, despite the fact that it's more expensive than onshore wind, we have 4 international developers proposing gigawatt scale plants. So they understand that there's a business case for building these plants, even because they're selling into the New Zealand electricity market. And the market price for electricity is sufficient for them to recover their costs and to make it commercially worthwhile to them. There's also a lot of discussion at the moment about I've forgotten the term, but having a fixed contract for power offtake. So take the example of a data center. A large data center could make an arrangement with the generator to take all of their output at a fixed price. And that gives certainty to the generator and certainty to the data center. And so I think the same sort of things could start to be developed for precision fermentation and other food production options as well. So you also mentioned the environmental impacts of offshore wind. Not particularly great at this stage. We've just had a bird study from Scotland which showed that over 2 years there was 0 collisions, right? 0 collisions. And this was done with turbine-mounted cameras, digital cameras mounted at the wind farm. That's not to say that bird collisions don't happen, but you know the impact has been pretty minor. The impact on ocean species, yes, there will be some impact, but again, there are some positives. Artificial reefs, the enhancement of fishing in the area, and the opportunities for diving, all kinds of aquaculture, etc. So it's there's a lot of pluses involved there with offshore wind as well. So part of the development of the regulatory framework, which I talked about earlier, is the initiation of bird studies. So that's starting up now, and the initiation of marine life studies, particularly in the South Taranaki area. So those are going ahead those are just getting started, I should say, as we speak, and there'll certainly be a lot of detail coming out over the next couple of years.
Thanks very much.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, good. Thank you.
Right. Well, we've got just a few minutes left, and I'll just grab one question from the chat. This is from Maren, is there a market for lab foods in the general population? If people are skeptical of eating less animal protein or eating tofu, would they take the extra step of going to lab-grown protein?
Okay, well, firstly, have a look at that Earthrise program and see the smile on the presenter's face as she eats this cultured meat. I think more generally, the way I see this is a survival move for the human race. And so when you're in survival mode, and maybe more close to home, when you're out tramping in the bush, you eat whatever food is appropriate for the occasion. And I think although there will be a lot of people who will find it difficult, it is possible to change. It's possible to change one's diet over time. So I think this would be part of the ongoing development and the ongoing process. I don't know if you have any vegan restaurants in Dunedin. We certainly do here. I think one of the best approaches is just prepare this food, make it delicious. Don't tell anyone that it's made from vegan sources or from cultured meat. Just get them to taste it and say, hey, how do you like it? And 9 times out of 10, people will say, this is great. But yeah, it's definitely a good question, and it's something which needs to be worked on as we go forward.
Yeah, and Robert has actually put a comment in the chat. New Zealand red meat consumption has declined by 2/3 over the last 20 years. So yes, diet change is possible. So thanks for that,
Thanks,
Robert.
Yeah.
Anyway, our time is up, and I'd just like to finish by thanking you very much, Ian, for a really stimulating talk. It takes visionaries like you to kind of put it out there, sort of create almost seemingly impossible dreams, and making connections across different fields, you know, energy, rewilding, protein, artificial proteins, and actually creating a vision for how those things might all work together in some sort of new system for the future. So congratulations on that thinking and all the work that lies behind that. There's lots of positive comments also in the chat towards you regarding the talk, and thank you so much. This has been recorded, so it will be available for others to listen to in the future. Thank you, Ian.
Well, thank you very much, Janet. It's been a delight, as usual, to be talking to the centre. Thank you again for the opportunity, and look forward to keeping in touch. Ciao.